I can fulfill that promise of enchantment. Thank you for those wonderful introductions, and to the UHV ABR reading series for having me here, and for all of you coming out today to talk about fairy tales a little bit. And these posters are beautiful. I've never seen such magic in a reading series poster, so I'm delighted. As you just learned, I've dedicated my entire career to fairy tales, to improving their critical reception. Readers have always loved them, of course, but also to preserve a tradition that I see as often maligned by critics and others. It's a very living and vibrant tradition, and I think having been invited to such a wonderful reading series to talk about fairy tales is a sign that fairy tales really are in a moment of rising, and that the movement I so longed to bring to the surface for the last 20 years of my life is at last real for others. The writer Italo Calvino once said, "The folk tale is real," and an event like today makes me feel that even more so. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the last 20 years of my obsessive work on behalf of fairy tales, and also read you a couple of new fairy tales of my own. And then I think there's time for questions. I first noticed fairy tales as an influence on contemporary writers around 20 years ago, when I began work on my novel trilogy, the third volume in which is soon to be out in the world, I think, in like a week maybe. And at that same time, I proposed my first essay collection about women writers and fairy tales. I noticed around that time, when I started to see the breadcrumbs of fairy tales in so many of the books that I love to read, from books by Charlotte Bronte to a book by a contemporary author like Dawn DeLillo, I started to notice at the same time a rather upsetting, discouraging, and widespread prejudice against fairy tales as non-literary stories, as minor, or worse, I think, as only for children, as if children are a lower class of human. And they're not. We are all former children, right? I started to notice that across the spectrum, fairy tales were often disparaged, and that a book, whether for children or adults, whether mainstream or avant-garde, could be dismissed by a reviewer as only a fairy tale, or just a fairy tale. At the same time, readers loved fairy tales, and fairy tales were seemingly quite popular in books and in film. So I really consciously at that time decided to dedicate myself to working against that rather harmful prejudice, against a body of work that spans hundreds of years and crosses boundaries all around the world. A body of work that is largely devoted to empowering, through wonder, the punished, the abused, and the weak, the underdogs, often the children. I found that they were so often reviled by critics, ironic to say the least, because they're a body of work dedicated to empowering those who aren't in power. So I felt this could be corrected by a form of what I thought of as sort of peaceful literary activism. You could call it covert, secretive maybe, in a fairy tale way. But I wanted to begin to invite as many people as possible to participate in what I called a fairy tale revival. I didn't really announce it. I just kind of started to do it. And as such, I worked to spearhead however I could through my own writing for children or for grown-ups and my own editorial projects to participate in this revival. And it culminated recently in the publication of the Penguin Anthology with the title, you just heard, My Mother, She Killed Me, My Father, He Ate Me, 40 New Fairy Tales. I got to invite 41 writers, although the title says 40. Penguin thought 40 sounded better than 41 in the title. So there's a secret story in there. I got to invite 40 writers from across stylistic practices to write a new fairy tale based on an old favorite tale. And that really is the culmination of so many years of thinking, and the excitement by people when they were asked to contribute to the book, whether they are known as a magical writer or not, was really special to me. The book did cause a slight controversy recently on Amazon because some readers felt that the title was intended as a form of propaganda to persuade children to begin practicing cannibalism, which it is not intended to do. But the title itself comes from a very old fairy tale called the Juniper Tree, and my mother, she killed me, my father, he ate me, is a refrain in the story. And it is a very sad, violent story about a little boy whose stepmother kills him and cooks him for his father's supper. And a little bird flies by and tattles on her. And there's a daughter in the story who's quite traumatized by all this because the stepmother sets her up to think that she's actually killed the brother, when in fact he's already dead. She ties his head on with a kerchief and props him up on often in the story it's like an apple chest, and the top goes down and the head rolls off. That may sound familiar to you because sometimes there are urban myths still wandering around in some circles about dogs whose heads are tied on. We had a neighbor when I was growing up who had a little dog and it had a red kerchief around its neck, and she always told me that the dog's head was only held on by the kerchief. I'm pretty gullible, and I totally believed her. But much to my delight, it was on in my 20s that I encountered the Juniper Tree for the first time, a rather adult fairy tale, not intended for children at all. Children love that story, though. And it sort of brought a lot of things full circle to me about how I related to the world, why I would believe Jamie Corlitt's telling me that her dog's head would fall off. Because the stories that fairy tales comprise are very, I want to say, realistic, even if they're not referred to often as realism. The folktale is real. Things happen in a fairy tale just when they need to happen. And they happen seemingly by chance, but they also feel just so. And that could explain sometimes how people refer to them as just so stories. It also explains sometimes people misunderstanding them as cliche or overly simple. So I like to celebrate their just so qualities, how things feel like they've been put there just for you, the reader. Just as a character finds something, so too do you reading. I think that experiencing a fairy tale is so much about experiencing the pleasure of reading and discovering a world where anything can happen, but things are in their place. It's very consoling. A writer you might have read, J.R.R. Tolkien, loved fairy tales for that ability to console the reader with their just so qualities, and he felt that their happy endings were quite underrated as well. A happy ending in a fairy tale usually only comes after great disaster. So if you look back at older versions of, say, Cinderella, she may be beaming and radiant on the last line, but if you look 3 lines up, her sisters are, hobbling around with blood spurting from their toes because they've cut their feet off trying to fit into a shoe, and somebody else is dancing on coals for the rest of her life, which will last forever. So these stories are actually quite brutal to their characters, but you can always count on one thing, which is that the good soul and the humble soul, the vulnerable, will be taken care of by animals, by the universe, and by magic. And I think that that's a wonderful thing, even if the world that we live in can't always offer us that consolation. A story can, just by the experience of reading and disappearing into it. So I think that they have a really wonderful complexity. And you know a fairy tale as soon as you're in one. You don't even need the words. If you see a red cape, a dog, and a pine tree, or a dog like Wolf, what story are you in? Little Red Riding Hood. You may never even have read it in a book, but you may have just recently seen a movie trailer for it, right? There are no fewer than 3 versions, I think, of Snow White in production this very year. One by Disney that said this very year it was never going to do another fairy tale again. I didn't believe it. I felt that they were probably reevaluating their princess stories and perhaps going back to fairy tales' darker and older, more adult roots, and indeed that seems to be what they're doing. Although I wouldn't exclude the possibility that we'll come out with another Wonderful Tangled or something like that. I thought that was a very clever film. you know a fairy tale when you're in one. And again, I think that that's a really remarkable quality about fairy tales. They seem very simple, and you know them, you're familiar with them, at the same time as they dislocate you from your day-to-day life. And I think if you look closely at them, you would really recognize, too, that they rely very much on very literary techniques to work their magic. But these literary techniques, I think, are not often talked about. What's often talked about with fairy tales is either cliches, that they're dangerous for children or limiting for girls, or that they're only for children and not for grown-ups. What happens is that their really wonderful techniques get overlooked, and then people don't understand why they return to them again and again. They use abstraction, so in a fairy tale there's very little color, maybe one color, maybe two. In Little Red Riding Hood, just a red cape usually, maybe some red wine in the older versions, not the ones I read as a kid. But the forest isn't lushly green. They're very flat, spare, and abstract. And then the real world is a magical world. So Little Red Riding Hood isn't alarmed when she runs into a talking wolf. She takes it completely at face value. Well, wolves might talk. Okay, I'll talk to him. She does, of course, get quite upset at the appropriate moment in the story when the wolf threatens to kill her and eat her. But she's not scared of a talking wolf. So the magic in the story is very day-to-day, just like in the real world. When you see something spectacular, you experience it right there in that moment. And stories that comprise the older tradition of fairy tales also don't contain very much psychological depth. This might be, well, this sounds like I'm criticizing myself, but it might be why I liked them, which isn't to say I'm shallow, but I did enjoy their flatness, that a character in a fairy tale might experience something really traumatic, but they didn't become neurotic as a result. They didn't develop insomnia, or not that there's anything wrong with that, but they didn't dwell on their problems. They had to survive. They had to find food. They had to find a safe place to sleep. There was this real high value placed on just basic day-to-day survival of characters who might have a hard time. And I found that, strangely, as a child and as a young adult, very consoling. Because I think, again, often we're not reminded or supported of the fact of, stories that don't support those who maybe have just a day-to-day basic hard time, finding a morsel of bread, feeding their young. And fairy tales really reinforce and celebrate the achievement of that, but really quietly. So the psychological depthlessness, I think, is something really interesting and often misunderstood. The characters aren't shallow just because they're flat. And it allows the characters to deal with some pretty horrific events. In one of the earliest known versions of Cinderella that you might not know, although maybe you do, referred to often as donkey skin, but it appears all around the world, in China and Africa. You see a character whose mother dies, and the father is so full of grief and so forlorn that he says he could never marry again because there could be no woman as beautiful or as wonderful as his wife. And he grieves for usually about a week until he sees his daughter, and he thinks, oh, she reminds me of somebody. And he asks her to marry him. This is the other Cinderella, not the one that Disney made. Anyway, she escapes, usually in an animal's hide, to a neighboring kingdom where she's put to work as a servant, and she's filthy, and everybody avoids her because she's covered in an animal skin. And eventually, yes, she is seen to be a quite remarkable survivor and sublime person, and is rescued from her servitude by a young man who turns out to be a prince usually. But they return at the very end of the story to her father's castle to live happily ever after with him. And it's pretty peculiar, right? You escape the sexual advances of your father, and then you return to marital bliss to care for him in his old age. Well, it's psychologically peculiar, but it's also just sort of matter of fact. What makes the story extremely peculiar is that when it was popularized for children by Perrault, he added, because he thought that fairy tales needed morals, a little poem at the end that I can't recite from memory. Do you know it from memory? It says something like, as long as there will be fathers and daughters in this world, we will have such wonderful stories as this. Doesn't go with the story at all, but somehow readers have accepted it, and I think that that's also what makes fairy tales so great. They are nonsense at the same time as they make sense, and we accept them for that. I'm really delighted to see increasingly in the 21st century a really widespread celebration of fairy tales starting to take place. So you have writers from, as I said, from mainstream to experimental, working with magical forms. You have filmmakers, visual artists, readers, young to old, enjoying books like Harry Potter. I mean, all about fairy tales. If you look in that book, she knew what she was doing in there. And I think that part of what's so great about this is it's cultivating for young readers a great love of the form. My hope is that all of these new fairy tales that are proliferating in our time will help turn readers back to those very old stories so that we can hope to preserve them. They're the endless tradition. They're the ultimate never-ending story, and you could never run out. I think it's part of why I fell in love with fairy tales as a child. You could just keep going back to the library, and there were always more. We love serial novels. We love sequels. Fairy tales are always sequels. There's no original version. You can just find endless version upon version. And again, they open themselves up to me as a writer, as a tradition for that reason too, because anybody can write one or read one too. And they seem so freeing in that way. They don't belong to the individual artist. They are a really communal art form. That to me was great, because I didn't become a writer because I wanted to celebrate myself. I became a writer because I wanted to live inside of a story, and fairy tales taught me how to do that and how we could do that. So I'm so happy that everything I've gotten to do in the last 20 years, as manic as it may all sound, from the editorial projects to the writing, has come to some fruition, and now people are starting their own fairy tale missions as well. It's really an honor. So I thought I would just read a couple of short new tales to you and then take some questions. These are very short stories based on older fairy tales. The first one I'll read is called Tale of Disappearance, and it's based on a Russian variant called Baba Yaga, which is about a witch who lives in the woods, and her house is on chicken feet and it spins. She also is known to either lure children in order to eat them, or to lure them in order to save them from some terrible violence they're about to experience. Nobody's really quite sure if she's the protector of children or the eater of children. She comes up in many different ways. I love Baba Yaga. The story only has a very loose connection to it. I was asked by a journal called A Public Space to do a collaboration with my brother, who's an architect, where he designed a building and I wrote a story to go along with it. And he wanted to make a building that was all made of nails. So he did these spectacular drawings, and then I had to do them justice to the story. I don't know if I did, but I'll read you the very short story. Tale of Disappearance. When I was very young, my sister told me that there is a witch in the woods who tries to find little boys, and when she finds them, she eats them. My sister kept me safe from the witch, at least most of the time. Then my sister was taken away. Before she was taken away, she told me to disappear into the woods so that the witch could not get me as well. She said, "Brother, here are the things that you'll need. Cardboard, brown paint, nails that change colors, twigs 6 inches long, 1/2 inch thick, gold bead, large fake bird, pruning shears." "Brother," she said, "you may cut a piece of cardboard about 5 inches square, and you may paint it brown if desired, or if your chosen cardboard is not brown to begin with. This will help disguise the cardboard, which will then disguise you. Snip your twigs in half and glue them to the front of the cardboard. Keep doing this until you've made a door. Then you take some more cardboard and make a roof. And then you glue a gold bead to the door handle. Nip the legs from your fake bird with pruning shears. Make sure the top of each leg is flat and even. Cut a 2-inch square of cardboard for each leg and glue them flat to the cut-ends of the legs. Let the glue cure for 10 minutes. Lay your house on its back with the door facing up. Glue the cardboard on the tops of the legs to the bottom of the house. Let them cure for at least an hour before standing the house up on feet. The house should be able to stand on its own. Then you should put it in the woods, and you should get inside with all of the nails. Hammer the nails into the cardboard. Then you are safe. If anyone sees you in there, they will think you're a witch, and only witches will see you, because the nails will change color along with the seasons and hide you from everyone else. I did as she said, and I made the house. One night, when the witch slept, I made the house. I carried it carefully into the woods. I set it down onto the ground. I became very tiny, and I crawled inside, and then I hammered and hammered. I'm still in here now. It's very cold here, and I'm very lonely. The crows visit the house and poke at it with beaks. Sometimes they tip it right over, and then the nails stick in the ground, and the fake bird legs stick up, and only a hard wind turns the house back over onto its right side, onto its feet once again. No one has ever found me, and I don't want them to either. The problem is, as I said, I'm very lonely. When I had my sister, she told me great stories. Now I have none, but the fragments I can remember, and I'm very old now, and I do not have a good brain. When I was little, my sister would go to her bedroom and put on her pink nightgown and slippers and run back to my room in the dark with a flashlight. She perched on the end of my bed with a big blue book of the witches, the only book in the house, but she never read me the words. She turned the pages, but I knew she told me things the book itself never said, things about ukuleles and rabbits and pirates and donkeys. She'd read, "Brother, once upon a time there was a glittering and beautiful place full of pirates and ponies and donkeys and monkeys. Brother, once upon a time there was a land of candy and marbles and doodads and saddles." But the book's real words were very ugly. I won't say any here, but they were all about power, about how you had to go to any means to obtain it. Secretly, we called it the only bad book in the world. I don't read anymore, of course, in my house of nails. The paper would make too much noise, and birds might try to eat it or soil on it. Still then, I'd have some company. It's lonely here in the woods, and my house is very heavy on me. Oh, no, you don't have to clap. Thanks. Thanks. This is another story, very short, called The Old Dinosaur, and it's based on a Brothers Grimm tale called The Old Man. And I wrote it on request for a journal called the Sonora Review, which is produced by the graduate students at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And they asked me specifically to write a story for children, story that was childlike but not for children, that had dinosaurs in it. Because they were producing an issue of Sonora Review that was going to have a pop-up section in the middle produced by, I think, an artist, maybe a comic artist, that was going to be pop-up dinosaurs. And they wanted a story to go along with that, and that was a very specific request. And sometimes an assignment can be a great liberating thing, and other times you just get really trapped by it. But something I do when I'm stuck in my writing, that you may have guessed I do, is read old fairy tales, and until I find the right one that lets me in. So this is The Old Dinosaur, and it bears very little resemblance to The Old Man, the story upon which it's based, except the shape of some sentences. An old dinosaur lived in a big city, and one evening he sat in his room all alone, thinking how he'd first lost his wife, then his 2 children, then little by little all of his relatives, and that very day, his last friend, a small child who had walked with him daily through the park blocks. He was alone and forsaken. He was sad at heart. Hardest of all to bear was the loss of his 2 daughters, and in his grief he blamed humans for his misfortunes. He was sitting quietly, deep in thought, when all at once he heard bells ringing from the church down the street. He was surprised to find that he'd sat up all night in his armchair by the fire. Usually he climbed into bed in giant pajamas, on which were printed little pandas and rainbows. He lit a lamp and left his apartment by the window. It was a flying dinosaur, the rarest on earth. The church down the street was lighted, though not with candles, with a strange and diffused glow in the air. It was crowded and all seats were taken. When the old dinosaur came to his usual seat, it was occupied, and so was the pew in front of it, and so was the pew behind it as well. When he looked around at all the humans, he saw that each one held a photograph of one of his relatives who had died. There the people sat in all manner of vintage clothing, elegant and dusty and black. Their faces were pale, and they did not speak, and they did not even sing. The church was filled with a buzzing murmur. It reminded him of bees, who also were gone. An elderly woman stood up and walked over to him. As she got closer, he saw that she was, in fact, a dinosaur too. Not only that, his beloved great aunt. She was dressed in the manner of humans and wore a black bonnet with a white lacy trim. Her pale green dinosaur face peeked out at him. In her hands, she held a photograph of herself torn out of a children's history book. "Look at that altar over there," she said, taking his arm. "You will see your two daughters." He looked, and he saw one hanging from gallows, the other tied to a wheel. "You see," said his great aunt, "that is what would have happened to them if they had lived and not turned into light. They were only innocent children." The old dinosaur flew home. It was difficult, as he was trembling, and when he got in the window, he kneeled on the hard wooden floor of his apartment. He'd been shown mercy, he thought. He kept sitting there, and on the third day, he lay down and died. He was the last dinosaur. There are no others. My story is done. Thanks. That was kind of depressing. I just noticed these stories have a lot in common, and I've been writing a lot of new, very short tales, and I think they might all have very lonely characters in them and a book. So I've got to figure something out about that. But they all take place, too, in a little room or a house. My brother and I are talking about collaborating on a whole series where he does the designs of the houses, and I put the characters in them. Maybe I'll give one of them a good friend. This one. I'm happy to take any questions that you have or to hear your thoughts on fairy tales, too. Yeah. That's a big question. So the question, if you didn't hear it, is correlating the resurgence of fairy tales to certain waves of feminism, beginning with Angela Carter, the great queen of fairy tales, without whom I would not be here doing what I am in the 80s. And it's interesting. It's a good question, and there's much talk about feminism in fairy tales on two sides of a binary, if you see things in binary fashion. One, people see them as great tales of empowerment with their clever heroines like Gretel, who saves her brother from the witch. And on the other end of the spectrum, people who see fairy tales as disempowering for women, because so often in some of the popularized versions, there's really only one end for a girl, right? To be happily married, to be found or rescued. But I think that all of these versions and the perspectives on them can peacefully coexist, which is one of the great things about fairy tales. So they can withstand scrutiny from almost any kind of critical inspection of what they are and what they do. I think that the popularity and resurgence of fairy tales does owe a lot to Angela Carter, although I find that general audiences don't know about her work. It's usually through, at least in my experience, somebody, a teacher or a colleague has introduced somebody to the work. I didn't get to read Angela Carter until I was in graduate school, and I was like, who's been hiding this person from me all my life? She's great. What happened around that time is that a lot of writers came of age who'd been weaned on Disney, and I think it did produce a certain proliferation of novels, books, stories, and artworks that were in direct reaction to that, either a rebellion against it or just an influence on the work more covertly. I was weaned up. My grandfather actually worked as a publicist in part for Disney. He wasn't hired by Disney, but by local movie theaters in Boston to promote movies. So he placed ads for movies, basically. But he also went to premiere openings of movies in Boston. He would screen us, this is before home theaters, he would screen us the Disney movies in his basement on a projector, like on reel-to-reel. And if the film broke, he'd like melt it together and splice it. It was very crazy and wonderful down there, and all of these characters were much larger than life to me because they were in my grandfather's house, these fairy tale characters. So I was weaned on Disney, and actually Disney stories don't stray that far from the older versions in certain ways, although they have this trope, right? The girl needing rescue. They've gotten a little bit better about that, I think, actually. You know, look at Belle, just like a bookworm, and the beast, such an oaf, which he always is in the old stories, too. It's always so disappointing when he becomes the prince, too. He's such a cute beast. But anyway, I thought that they did a pretty good version because the library is the hero in that version, too. I think that there was a wave of writers who came out of that, just coming of age moment with fairy tales. And fairy tales, too, were still books that you would give to children in the 60s and 70s. I don't know if children receive older collections now of the Grimms or of Hans Christian Andersen or other folk tales, but I always had one as a kid. I think that's in part to thank for what we have now, this resurgence today. The resurgence, too, in the Fairytale Revival, I think, is almost like it comes in waves, often at the turn of a century if you map its course. But I think fairy tales have never really waned, but people's perspective on them has changed, and they've gone through a hard time, in part because the feminist critiques of the stories that have been canonized in Western culture especially were often right on. And so there was a falling away from them. But then in part two, there was a proliferation of them again as a result because people started to look for other fairy tales to read to their children or to transform for adults. And so every time fairy tales get sort of stepped on, justifiably or not, they rise up again, which is great. They have this very natural ability to regenerate themselves, which is really neat. Have you read a lot of the feminist critiques of fairy tales? Angela Carter's so good. Do you have a favorite Angela Carter story? Wolf Alice is a really good story if you get to encounter it. Yeah. I love that title too, Wolf Alice, because it harkens to fairy tales and also, you know, to Lewis Carroll and everything magical in books. Yeah. Yes. I think that those can coexist. Again, fairy tales lend themselves freely to all kinds of theoretical interpretation, from Jungian to Freudian to feminist to biologists. You know, biologists study fairy tales too for information about what plants served what purpose in history and how people's thinking has changed. You know, so I think that all those things can coexist. I think that if you look at them formally, you see in an old fairy tale, by which, when I say old, not hundreds of years old, but really old, but not that old really in human time. You see like the bones of story. You see their skeletal parts. You see like just the very pieces of story that you need to even know you're in one. So there's something elemental about them, and we recognize them whoever we are. We feel that we're in them. We know what they are. So I think that there is something elemental about them. I appreciate the use of the term archetypal. I don't necessarily myself know if they're archetypal or if they're just artifacts. They change, of course, over time. So there are cultural components to them. They travel through time. We don't know why these versions appear all over the world. Is it because people traveled more than we thought? Or is it because our brains, you know, through chemistry or magic, generate the same images and motifs? Is it because Bettelheim, you know, as Bettelheim said, all children are terrified of being eaten, that Hansel and Gretel appears around the world? Then why do children love being chased by a grandmother who says, you're so delicious, I'm going to eat you up, right? Why do we delight in those things? I don't know, but for me, there's something really elemental in them. I did once come across a study that said fairy tales, old fairy tales, syntax, that is the grammar of them, mirrors the way our brains learn to understand narrative. So the order of a story is exactly the way your brain orders narrative. I could explain some of it, but I wouldn't presume to be an expert in that. So, yeah. Maybe time for one more question. Oh, yay! Yes. And you don't study fairy tales. Terry Pratchett is great. Well, I'll take the parallel universe approach, right? That fairy tales have evolved almost like parallel in another universe from the one that we've thought, that we've experienced ourselves. And they're so lifelike that way, like art, right? So lifelike, but not life at the very same time. I think that you can see incredible, remarkable moments in evolutionary history in fairy tales. Yes, where children may have been eaten, right? You might have sent your children out into the woods because you didn't have enough to eat and it was them, or, you know, there are a lot of basic biological needs in fairy tales. And also if you look at the use of frogs as sort of like transformative in fairy tales, you can see a lot of chemistry there too. I think that fairy tales are in a parallel universe. They contain our whole world, even though we can't enter it completely. That's my answer. But I also think that, like life, fairy tales take place forever after and also always end. So they have this kind of never-ending quality that time has too. And it's more an answer, not in terms of biology, but physics, right? That time may or may not exist, right? Past, present, future. Fairy tales also have that quality where time is always collapsed. And so I think that there might be an answer in there somewhere. I'd love to know your answer someday too. Thank you.